Welcome back, and a regular update. They say a week is a long time in politics or a long time in sport. In this case, it's a long time in, well, life really, with everything that's going on with the coronavirus and the economy. And, well, just last week, Virgin Airlines still existed last week. Lots happened. To update on what's happening and a bit of an overview on what's going on in the economy and the world on a broader scale. Renowned economist from Stratosfear with an F-E-A-R on the end, Jamie Holroyd. Weird times still, isn't it?
Tom, it's I feel like I'm caught in my own action movie at the moment. It's been a very surreal sort of couple of weeks. My wife described it as a perpetual extension of that time between Christmas and New Year's, where it just doesn't feel like anything's happening and you're not sure what day it is and you're not sure what's open, right? And I think that's about as true as you can get. So,
yeah, very much so. Let's kick it off with the talk about Virgin. They've gone into administration. There appears to be some interested parties in doing something. They were rejected by the federal government for a $1.4 billion bailout, but that said, the government's still paying JobKeeper to them, so they're paying a heap of money to them anyway. Well, hardly unexpected, is it?
Wow, look, Tom, every time we have some sort of serious financial crisis, a recession or a recession-like circumstance, airlines always fall over, right? If we go back to the 1991 recession, I think it was Compass Airlines. You might remember there was Compass 1, 2, and I think actually 3. And then more recently, during the September 11 attacks and the Ansett fell over. So it shouldn't be a shock that we've got, and it's always going to be the second airline. In Australia, look, we're a large country with a small population. Running a domestic airline is very difficult to have. We need two because we need some sort of sense of competition. Having three is not really possible. So you're always going to have those moments where you're under pressure. Now, it was Warren Buffett, I believe, who said that if you take the profits of every airline that ever existed and you add it together, it comes to less than zero. He also said that if he saw the Kitty Hawk take off as an investor, he would have shot it down. So you shouldn't be shocked. Now, this raises a really great question around what we call moral hazard. So moral hazard, for those not familiar with it, really relates to the fact that if you allow government to bail out industry, it means that industry can take excessive risks without having to wear the downside. And that when you bail out organisations, it means you end up with more risk. So during the debt crisis, the South American debt crisis of the early 1980s, that all the American business leaders and economists were saying, can't bail them out, moral hazard, you'll have more of this. But obviously when it got to the GFC and it was their turn, that they had a new phrase, too big to fail. So now the challenge with bailing out someone like Virgin Airlines is you would have seen, Tom, straight away then Qantas put the hand up. Well, if you're going to give them money, we want money as well. So it is an interesting question.
The topic of the bailout, all things considered, the government's making one sort of noise saying, oh yeah, we want the competition, we want you to exist, but we're not going to bail you out. You've got international airlines as major shareholders. You've got Richard Branson, who, from all appearances doesn't be short of a dollar, all saying, and taking a bit of a slap at the Australian government for not bailing them out. It's a difficult one to sort of really fathom whose responsibility it is, if it's anyone's responsibility other than shareholders.
Well, look, this is something that I can stretch across two points of view on this. The first one is, if we discuss the issue of moral hazard, when we're talking about moral hazard, we're saying that as an organisation, too bad, it's your fault. Your company is in the position it's in because of the way you ran it, and we are not bailing you out. Now, in this circumstance, we are really talking about the impact of government policy. So it's the government that decided policy response to the coronavirus. So effectively, it's got nothing to do with Virgin per se. If the government changes the law and impacts on you, so the government wants to put a road right through your house, well, typically, you'd be compensated for the fact that they want to reclaim your house. So on the one hand, I think it's fair enough that if there is a change in government policy that's impacted your commercial property rights, that you should be compensated. On the other hand, you do have that dilemma. Some of the shareholders are foreigners, and some Chinese. And you also have Richard Branson, who's, likes to flaunt his wealth a little bit and lives on a private island. And Joe, the taxpayer's got a right to say, why are we giving money to these people? So it's one of those, if we look at these problems, Tom, they're what we call wicked problems. And they're wicked because they're so complex, and every decision affects another decision. And there is no right and wrong. There's only bad or worse decisions that can actually be made. So it's going to be an interesting one. Now, from an economic point of view, if some industries are, historically the car industry has been one where it's more symbolic than economic. That if the symbolism of an airline falling over feels really bad. And if you want a quick recovery out the other side, trying to deal with the fallout of a failed airline is going to be challenging. As someone pointed out to me the other day, when Ansett fell over, at least you can go and join another airline, right? But at the moment, no one's flying anywhere. So it just depends on what form. If you were, let's run this for a little bit. If you were going to bail out the airline because you think it's the right thing to do, you think the government probably has some obligation, how would you do it? Now, what you could potentially do, and I haven't thought too much about this, but to provide some sort of credit ticketing where you actually, Joe, the public got entitled to a discounted airline flight at some other point. And so then you would actually save the airline now and then stimulate the economy later on. So maybe the government, you pre-purchase a 50% ticket or something like that, and maybe the government underwrites the rest of it. And you preserve the airline, get the tourism industry going once it's in a capacity to do so. So this raises another really interesting point, Tom. We've been tracking all the stats on, confirmed cases, the death rate. Now, Australia is a complete outlier. Our death rate is basically about 1/10 to 1/8 of what it is anywhere else in the world. Now, there may be a couple of reasons for that. I haven't really seen the medical explanation, but intuitively, we probably have 3 or 4 things that are different. One is, our isolated status, that we are an island nation. Secondly, we've been coming out of summer, going into winter. Now, there's a bit of conjecture whether the season makes a difference to COVID deaths or not. Some say it does, some say it doesn't. The other one is our population density as well. So, but there is, so you add those couple of factors together and you get an outcome that's much lower than in other parts of the world. Now, I haven't tracked this too closely, but I see in Africa that's the rate similar to what it is here. Now, that's quite an anomaly when you think that you do have places in Africa where people never wash their hands with soap, right? So you would expect if the coronavirus is going to cut through anywhere, it would be some of those underdeveloped third world countries, and it hasn't really happened. Now, one of the blessings that's discussed is when we had the bushfire crisis back in January and February, tourists weren't coming here. Now, that may be an explanation as to why our confirmed cases is a lot lower than we possibly expected or should anticipate.
Interesting one. Circling back from the Virgin one before we go off that, because there's a lot of related parties and related stories to that. Sport, we're both sports nuts. We're hanging out for sport to start again. But of course, Virgin, major sponsors of the AFL, major sponsors of motorsport, they go into administration or worse, they fall over. The impact through to sport in terms of the companies, not just Virgin, but the local IGA or, the local motor mechanic coming out of this that traditionally has sponsored the local footy club. They're not going to be in the same sort of position coming out of this. That's going to have a flow-on effect to sport as well, isn't it?
Well, when you talk about a wicked problem, not only do you have no good and no bad, you only have bad and worse, but every decision then has some sort of flow-on consequence for some other decision. And so if I was the government, I'm not sure anyone's made the case that you just have, Tom, but the flow-on impact for sports and that professional level sport. So 2 of our most popular sports, people realise or not, AFL and motorsport is one of the largest, most followed sports in Australia as well. So it will certainly impact their capacity to come out the other side of what that actually looks like. And it's almost an act of cruelness to lock us all up and not give us any sport to watch, Tom. So, well,
that's very true. I like the thought about the that's an interesting angle. I haven't heard that floated yet at all. But certainly people have talked about the government taking a stake for an investment in Virgin. There's some merit in that sort of, maybe. But the idea about it being done as a double whammy, as a stimulus package for the economy and for the public, so therefore the public does actually take an ownership, if you like, of Virgin. That's an interesting angle, and that's worth exploring further, I reckon.
Well, the only reason you haven't heard about it is because I only just thought of it. So,
no doubt. Let's talk about also the other side of it is Virgin, amongst many other companies, now being propped up by the government through the JobKeeper program. There's varying stories. Everyone, I think, universally goes, it's a great concept. Good on the government for actually sticking their neck out, throwing the idea of a surplus out the window and going, this is what we need to do. But there seems to be surfacing an awful lot of practical issues about applying, who gets it, what happens with it, what happens if you're a casual or a part-timer and don't earn $1,500, but you're now being paid $1,500 a fortnight, what rights do employers have to get you to do more? There's a whole bunch of stuff coming out now that, the devil in the detail.
Well, look, Tom, we have a great saying that we use at Stratosfear a lot. There's always time to do it right the second time, right? When you rush something, there's always going to be holes and always going to be anomalies. The government will give itself a free pass by saying, just like the Rudd government did, we had to get things happening. We had to get it happening quickly. You know, we're seeing some bizarre scenarios. If you think of economics, it's a little bit like water, right? So if you pour water into any sort of cavity, it will settle in the lowest point and end up even. And business is much the same. If you have a system or structure that's got holes or weaknesses or dark spots, business owners are very, very quick to find them, right? So we're seeing a bunch of, what do you call it, manipulation, distortions, new interpretations of accounting, maybe we could call it, around timing.
Exploitation. What is not unfair?
What if my sales have gone down 25% but not 30%, right? So that becomes an interesting challenge for some businesses. Now, we talk about what are we seeing, right? And just to the listeners and people who might have caught our previous podcast, but in terms of what we're seeing, we look at where's the noise coming from? Where are we seeing 5 or 6 examples of things that suggest to us that this is a broader issue that's going on? This week, people have been very distracted and busy with registering for JobKeeper, getting all that sort of stuff done, working out what they're entitled to. So that's certainly been the focus of most businesses. I've had a couple of business owners who you can see clearly they feel uncomfortable with the fact that government's giving them all this money. And we've had the same conversation about 4 or 5 times where people have said, almost like they have to somehow justify it, that, well, I pay a lot of tax and I've always paid a lot of tax and, you know, maybe I'm entitled to it when they're clearly entitled to it. So, you know, and I've sort of said to them, look, the government wants you to do this. The government wants you to have this money. They want you to spend it. They want you to keep people employed. So, you know, you don't have to sit there and justify it, or just get on with it. So.
No, good point. The other side of that is keeping the economy flowing. So we've got the job keeper, we've got the job seeker. So the increase in funding for unemployed people or people who have been affected by it, as well as people who are already unemployed. And of course, the super withdrawal. So the ability to take money out of super, out of kilter with what you're normally able to do in retirement. There's a lot of talk also about that in terms of the impact on the super funds, on the share market, because that's where the super funds are invested, and the flow on it there. If a whole bunch of people go and access their $20,000, so $10,000 this financial year, and we're not far from the start of the next financial year, what impact is that going to have going forward?
Well, look, I have, you know, it's something I've turned my attention to, because clearly if you have a large number of people taking out money at the same time, it will have an impact. And you have to expect it to have an impact on the share market. Apparently, we're being told that it's been modelled and it won't have that much impact. It depends on how quickly people access it. Now, I'd suggest to people you want to get in early just in case it does have an impact on the share market, and therefore the amount you get out effectively is more than the impact on you is less. There's also the thing to consider that there's lots of people not working, so that money won't be flowing into the share market the way it was as well. So you have to expect that things will come off and the share market may continue to go down. There's a lot of uncertainty. If I look at the counter perspective, then we talked about, you know, a 6-month best case scenario, a 12-month likely case scenario, and an 18-month worst case scenario in terms of business planning. But it's now looking like the best case is probably, you know, 2 or 3 week scenario, and getting things a bit more back to normal. Schools are going back, which I think is a big psychological edge. The number of cases being confirmed each day, we're starting to get zeros in different regions. In WA, and I'm not across what's happening over in the other states, but we've kind of got locked down in certain geographies. So there's almost states within the states, barriers within the states. So there's those regions which don't have any cases, so there's no reason why they couldn't get back to normal. So I think the depth of this is feeling a lot shallower than anyone expected. So, now that doesn't mean we couldn't have a second wave, but I think we're probably dealing with more certainty than we had before. The fear always is, and I think, you know, through human history, we have these things whether we know it or not. But yeah, we are, in the back of our mind, there's the plague and things that almost wiped out humanity previously. There's sort of 200 million people in Europe that were wiped out during that period of time. And there's always a consciousness in the back of our mind that, well, could this be the same sort of thing? So it's right and normal and natural that people would think, boy, this is going to be terrible. But if you look at this stats, Tom, it's not really that bad. Now, you know, people dying is not great, but it's not significantly worse than other things that we deal with most in normal day life. So,
on that, one of the issues that the government is using as a bit of a big stick rather than the carrot is this isolation, or this app, in terms of being able to track people about who they've come in contact with if they do happen to be tested positive. There seems to be there's an awful lot of suspicion. There's an awful lot of people concerned about privacy issues, as you can pretty much understand. But equally, a lot of people really speaking out very, very loudly about the fact that we don't trust this. It could be the thin end of the wedge in terms of government gathering more data on us, as if they don't have enough now. And that sort of stuff. The government app, what's your take on that? Is it an overreaction?
Tom, look, there's certain things that you kind of know with a great deal of certainty what the outcome's going to be. The government is doomed to failure on that. It will never fly in 100 years. If you think about the reaction that we had, and, you know, probably people only of our vintage, Tom, would remember, but the Australia card, they wanted a massive, massive backlash against that. And I think this will be the next one. Apparently, the government needs 40% of people to take it up. I would expect there'll be the 3 to 5% of people that are wedded to some sort of much more noble mission that will go and have the app already, and everyone else will give it a big wide berth, I think.
I think there's a similar program in Singapore, which has actually experienced a second wave of positive through a whole bunch of dormitory. So visitors basically to Singapore. I was speaking to someone yesterday who was saying that the second wave is much worse than the first in terms of volume. And most of that has come through travellers going into Singapore. That was hard to isolate, but they've got a similar tracking app, and their take-up has been about 17% across. Yeah. And of course, the government in Singapore probably holds a bit more sway than the government in Australia in terms of getting people to do what they want.
Well, look, Singapore is a great anomaly, right? It sort of sits somewhere between, China and Australia in terms of, it should be, a lot more dictatorial than it is, but it seems to work, right? It's the one place on earth where things seem to work and work well. Now my colleague Jackie has made this a point really strongly a number of times. And if you go back to the GFC, her view on it was that in Australia, we overreacted. And the reason we overreacted was because Wayne Swan was in Washington when it was all unfolding. And if you look at the app, the Chinese have they had a similar app, right? And so we're responding to what people have done elsewhere and what seemed to work. The Chinese government can do what it wants, right? And in Australia, it's just not going to be the same. And look, my question is, Tom, do we need it, all right? Now, I've made this parallel, and I need just to make sure I'm not trying to trivialise the issue, but it does give you perspective. I'm a Geelong supporter. Geelong's playing the Gold Coast Suns up at Metricon Stadium, and there's 6,600 people there. We're telling everyone this is a disaster. there's no one there, it's not going to work. That's the number of people that we have affected by the virus. So it's a very, very small number. It's a fraction of a percent. So I just can't see people rushing out to get the app.
No,
now, if you compare it with
Gold Coast,
what happens in the States, Tom, and I know that, like in Australia, we're a bit removed. One of my very good friends, my old next door neighbour, the American, he was the US commander of the 7th Fleet. So I'm a lot more kind of exposed to him and his friends and the way they view the world. But if you think about the American experience, we think they're all mad. But they are much more prepared to run the risk that everyone's got a gun and we might shoot each other. They're much more prepared to run the risk that, you know, my freedom's more important than catching the coronavirus, because they think that those two things are far more preferable than running the risk of having the government turn on them.
Now, speaking of the American government, obviously everyone around the world except Americans seem to have a very different opinion of American and its politics and Trump and all the rest of it. On the surface, as an outsider looking in, it looks like it's an absolute disaster. And he's got an election coming up in November. What's the story with them? What's your read on the US and them coming out of this, and particularly what's happening in New York more than anywhere else?
Yeah, well, look, there's a couple of issues there. So let's unpack them one at a time, right? So the first one is that there's a sense of crisis in the States, that it's all not working, that Donald Trump hasn't managed it. At Tom, the great thing about being in isolation is you can keep yourself entertained with Donald Trump's daily press conferences. And if you might recall that the Democrats were saying that you know, he's not having these press conferences, press briefings like they used to. Now they're complaining that he's having these live conferences and they want to cover him. And the thing that is interesting is I've watched a number of them, and his ability to deconstruct the arguments made against him is quite compelling. So it's clear that the narrative that it's all chaos and not working's not clear. There's a number of, you know, factual errors, whether you call them fake news or what you want to call them, but, you know, his ability to dismantle some of the arguments made against him. Now, if you watch the conferences in full, you do get a much different picture of what's going on, much more fact-based. Clearly, it has his own spin on it. Now, the other thing I sort of notice is that it would appear that the virus has been far worse in those highly densely populated international cities. So Milan, New York, you know, other places in Europe, Spain. So whether it's a function of, you know, the demographics and the urban environment, it appears to be playing into it in some degree. Obviously, you know, America's a very large country with a very large population, seems to be centered in New York. You had people on both sides of the political fence saying it was all fine only a few weeks ago. So we just have to see how it pans out. But my understanding is, in terms of ventilators and, you know, makeshift hospitals, there's capacity there to deal with what arises. So I'm not sure it is the chaos that's been painted to be. But as we've talked about many times, your narrative, your enemies try hard to write it for you. So.
Very true. In terms of local business, just circling back to where we started from, someone trying to navigate things like JobKeeper, bank finance. We haven't touched on the banks too much today, but we will next time again. But that sort of thing, and also how they're going to restructure and come out of this, because not too many businesses are going to come out of this looking the same. How do they contact you, and what sort of assistance can you give?
Yeah, look, so they can contact us via our website, or they can contact me directly on 0422 907 902. But I made this point more recently, Tom, and you'll see it on our Facebook page, but also on our LinkedIn page, that you really do need to do an updated strategic plan. So if you think about all the things that have changed, like the market environment has changed, your customers have changed, the demand has changed, the way people buy has changed, supply chains have changed, your staff have changed, their family circumstances have changed, where they work from has changed, your internet speed's changed. It's hard to think of anything that hasn't changed. So you do need to sit down and do either update a strategic plan or write a new one. Certainly that's what we specialise in, we can help people with. the one thing that we do know, and you only need to ask any insolvency practitioner, is most businesses that end up in insolvency don't have a good strategic plan.
Yeah, good advice. As always, interesting, whole bunch of topics. It's fast moving, this stuff at the moment, just trying to keep up with all the news and the information and the changes. You'd imagine like being a policymaker at the moment in government would be a 26-hour-a-day job at the moment, but and trying to advise.
I think if I just flip to the alternate view, right? So we've almost done the doomsday to death. But if you flip to the alternate view and you say, well, this is not going to be a 6-month lockdown, this is going to be another couple of weeks, and business gets back to normal, then what happens? Then you've got massive stimulus being poured into the economy, which may not need it, right? Certainly in some sectors. So some businesses are going to come out of this recapitalised by the government. The government's going to come out with a lot of debt. So we've got, I keep referring back to it, but it is a wicked problem because it's really hard to identify. So now if you look at the other scenario, if you have a really highly stimulated economy that doesn't need it, you will end up with a lot of inflation. You will end up with higher interest rates. So that's got to be a risk longer term as well.
No, very much so. There's a lot to consider, and of course, well, we'll keep considering. We'll speak to you in the next few days and get another update because there's lots happening, but lots of opportunities as well. Jamie Holroyd from Stratosfear, always good to chat to you. We'll speak again shortly.
All right, thanks, Tom.